Hi, Moraga. It's your Superintendent, Julie Parks, and I'm here with a superintendent's update as we begin the second week of school. On today's agenda, some celebration of our first day last week. It was a wonderful day, and so I'm excited to celebrate some of the things that I was able to see as I joined all of our students back at school for the first day this year. Next, we'll head into some of the informational topics around quarantining and contact tracing. These are very confusing. I hope to outline them a little bit better for you all so that you have some more clarity around what to expect. And lastly, we'll get into a topic that's been coming up quite a bit, the free lunch program in California, due to be implemented at the beginning of next year. So first, let's start with the celebration. We opened up school for full in-person instruction at the beginning of the year. This is always a day filled with joy and magic dust, and this year was no different than the previous years that I have experienced. It was my privilege to get to visit each of the school sites. I went by JM, where they are busy, the full staff unpacking their classrooms and getting things put back together after a busy year of modernization projects. Everyone is working so hard there to get that school ready to go for our kids. I know if you've driven by, you've seen our beautiful new landscaping and paint. The classrooms are also updated inside, and our staff has been working really hard to get those all ready to go. At Donald Ream, I got to see morning recess, which was absolutely delightful as children saw their friends for the first time after a long summer break. At CP, I got to see the magical moment of families reuniting at the end of a school day for early dismissal. And at LP, I got to be there for part of their PTA meeting as they got things going and off to a great start there. So lots going on at all of our school sites. Our elementaries also had their back to school nights last night, which I know were a real hit and very highly attended by our families. I'm looking forward to JM's back to school night coming up this week. So now we'll get into some of the informational items. We're going to start with quarantining. And as I go into this piece of the presentation, I want to assure you that if you don't feel like you have this memorized by the end, that is just fine. Our job will be to make sure that you get all of the information when you need it in the event that you get contacted by our school staff. So we're going to keep most up to date on these things and make sure that you have the real-time information as it's necessary. But I did want to make sure people had a little bit of a big picture understanding of what you can expect as we begin the school year. And the first thing that I'll say about quarantining is that it's a bit more complicated than last year. In the spring of last year, there was really only one answer to quarantining, and that was if you had an exposure, you needed to stay home. Now, with higher vaccination rates, with some of our students even vaccinated at the middle school, and some more science and understanding around how masks really work to prevent the spread of COVID-19, we're able to engage in some different layers of quarantining depending on exposure. And so what's great about that is our students are really going to be staying in their classrooms more, and we won't be having to have as many students staying at home long term, which is great for our schools and learning and great for our kids so that they continue to be included daily in their classrooms. Of course, when students do need to be out, we'll have all sorts of supports in place to make sure that you get what you need while they're out, and when they come back in, that they are brought back into the classroom environment and caught up very quickly. So let's go ahead and start walking through these different scenarios. The first one is really the most likely. If a student is symptomatic, let's say that they wake up in the morning and they have a small fever or a cough or a sore throat, generally pretty routine types of illnesses that we see with our kids. But in this climate of COVID-19, we have to be a bit more careful. So if your child does have a symptom in the morning, they must stay home. And they are going to stay home until the following conditions have been met: that 24 hours have passed since their fever has subsided, that their other symptoms have improved, and that one of the following conditions has been met. Either they have evidence of a negative COVID-19 test, or you went to go see a doctor because what's really happening with your child is a chronic condition like asthma that's causing some shortness of breath, and you have documentation of that. Or when you went to go see the doctor, you found out that your child indeed has an alternative diagnosis, something like maybe strep throat. If that is documented by your doctor, you can bring that doctor's note as you come back into school and come back to the school environment. If you do not get tested for COVID-19 and there is no alternative diagnosis, your child will need to stay home for 10 days until the symptom onset. So, in order to support you with this, we'll be providing you a list of testing sites so that you'll have an easy access to those different local sites for testing. And we'll also provide you with support for missed classes. This will happen in the form of a short term independent study where teachers will send home some work. And if your child is feeling well enough to work from home, they'll be able to do that work at home. If your child is not feeling well enough, no worries. As soon as they are feeling well enough and coming back to our school sites, we'll work with them individually to get them all caught up. Now, the second scenario here is if your child is tested positive for COVID-19. So, if this happens, your child will stay home, and your child will need to stay home until 24 hours have passed since the fever onset, other symptoms have improved, and for a full 10 days. So, to be clear, if your child is positive for COVID 19, they'll really need to stay home for 10 full days. And this is where it'll be really important for our families to have access to that independent study work at home so that if students are still on their 10-day quarantine but feeling well enough to do work, they'll be able to do some of that school work while they stay at home. Now, the next set of scenarios that I'm going to go over have to do with contacts of COVID-19 positive cases. And so, as students are exposed to students who may be positive for COVID-19, they'll be individually contacted, and we'll give you the requirements for a modified quarantine or a full quarantine, depending on the circumstance. So, the first circumstance I'm going to talk about is a masked close contact. So, will be generally what happens when our children are identified as close contacts within the classroom. Since they're wearing masks at all time, there'll be masked close contacts if they're sitting in close proximity with a student who has a positive COVID-19 test, and they will need to engage in a modified quarantine. So, what this means is they'll be able to continue to come to school on that modified quarantine as long as they remain asymptomatic. If at any point they have a symptom, they will need to stay home. But if they are asymptomatic, they'll just be continuing to come to school while they're in their masks, just like our normal rules have applied to all students. They'll also need to get tested 2 times per week to verify that they are indeed negative for COVID-19. And those tests should be submitted to our office. We'll provide you with a list of testing locations to hopefully streamline that process for you. And lastly, although they're on a modified quarantine in our school setting, they should be quarantining from other extracurricular activities outside of school during this time. Now, there is a little caveat here. If a student is negative on day 5, then their modified quarantine will be lifted on day 7. So if a child gets that negative test on day 5, this modified quarantine will only last for 7 days. Now, if a student is identified as an unmasked close contact, and this could happen in a circumstance where a child is outside on the playground, masking is not required by the state of California outdoors at this time. So, if a child is out on the playground playing with another child and they are unmasked, they could be identified as an unmasked close contact if they're spending more than 15 minutes in close contact with each other. If this happens, your child will be asked to be on a home quarantine. They'll need to stay at home, and they'll need to stay at home and monitor symptoms. And if they have a negative test on day 5, they'll be able to return to the classroom on day 7. If they do not take a test, the student will return on day 10. And so this is another instance where a short-term independent study would be really valuable because we'd want that child to be continuing to keep up with classmates while at home as long as the child was asymptomatic and feeling well enough to engage in the curricular content. And I'll add that this is one reason why I might advise that parents talk to their children. And if your child can tolerate wearing a mask outdoors for a longer period, I would recommend that children eat their lunch and then put their mask back on while they're outside. This will reduce the chances of your child being named as a close contact in an unmasked situation. And the last case here is if you are a vaccinated close contact. So, vaccinated students and adults have a little bit of a different set of rules. And at JM, we have many students who are already vaccinated. If they are identified as a close contact, they will not need to quarantine as long as they remain asymptomatic. Although we do recommend testing between day 3 and day 5 just to be sure. And so, if students are vaccinated, no quarantine necessary as long as they are asymptomatic. We're going to be reaching out to families at JM to gather information on vaccination status about students so that as we are contact tracing, we have that information and we can provide you with the best recommendations based on the information we have. So let's talk about contact tracing since that's an important part of this discussion. If a child does have a positive COVID 19 test, we begin contact tracing with an interview. We're going to interview that student on their close contacts, identify nearby students in the classroom using teacher seating charts, and then we'll begin the process of notifying families of close contacts. You'll be specifically notified if your child is a close contact of a child who is tested positive for COVID 19. And at that point, we'll give those families information on testing sites and short term independent study if the student needs to be on a home quarantine, and additional information to support navigating the situation of being a close contact. And the last step that our offices will be doing is tracking the return dates for students. As you may have noticed on some of the previous slides, the return dates vary depending on the circumstance, and our office will be tracking that so that we can let you know what your return date will be. And we'll be communicating all of this information transparently through a dashboard that will get posted up to our website this week. And on that dashboard, you'll be able to see the number of cases and number of quarantines within our community so that you can track that on a larger scale. But remember, if your child is a close contact, you get a specific communication from us so that you will know what next steps to take to be safe and to be in compliance with our rules at our schools. And the last piece here is on lunches. We'll be implementing the free lunch program in the 2022-2023 school year in compliance with the new California law. In the interim, if any students need a free lunch, they should go to our website where we have posted right in the middle some information about how to apply. We'll make sure that students who need lunches get them while we're waiting for this law to be fully implemented across the state. So looking forward to the time where we're able to feed all of our students in Moraga next year. So that concludes my screencast for today. I know that was a lot of information. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and have a great day.